Hey guys, you ever wonder when people actually started smoking weed? Like, not modern 420 kind of weed, but way back before there were lighters, rolling papers, or even words for dude, pass it, because somehow, in every age of history, humans looked at a random green plant, saw smoke coming out of it, and thought, yeah, I want to see what that does. Imagine the world thousands of years ago. Number cities, no TikTok, no munchies, waiting in the frigidest quiet nights, crackling fires, and someone staring at the stars, thinking maybe the universe wants to talk. Maybe it all started there. Someone tosses a plant into the fire, takes a whiff of that sweet strange smoke, and boom, the first high. Maybe they didn't even mean to do it. Maybe it was an accident. Or maybe, deep down, humans were always chasing that little spark that makes the world feel softer around the edges. The truth is, weed has been part of human life for way longer than most people realize. This isn't a modern rebellion thing, it's ancient. Long before dispensaries and vape pens, before Bob Marley ever strummed a guitar, before anyone even said the word stoned, people were using cannabis to pray, to heal, to celebrate, to forget, and to see what lies beyond ordinary sight. It wasn't a bad habit, it was sacred. Archaeologists have found traces of cannabis in tombs older than the pyramids. Think about that. People were getting high before they even figured out how to build skyscrapers or empires. In Central Asia, thousands of years ago, they used to gather around campfires, drums beating, smoke swirling in the air, believing that the spirit world could be reached through the breath of the earth. The smoke, it wasn't getting high for them, it was connection. And somewhere up there, under the same stars we still see, a few of them must have sat back, smiled, and thought, wow, this feels kinda nice. The earliest evidence we have comes from a place called the Pamir Mountains, on the border of modern-day China and Tajikistan. Archaeologists dug up a 2,500-year-old burial site there. They found wooden bowls and little stone burners, still stained with residue that tested positive for cannabis, with really high THC levels. Yes, people back then weren't just growing hemp for rope or clothes. They were using the good stuff, and it wasn't random. Those graves belonged to the elite, maybe shamans or tribal leaders. It looks like weed wasn't for fun, it was for the soul. Imagine that scene. Mountain wind howling, torches flickering, a circle of people around a fire. They light the herbs, inhale the thick musky smoke. Their drums echo in the cold night air. Their eyes close, their breathing slows. And maybe, for a few moments, they felt closer to their gods. There's something timeless about that image, right? Because even today, in a totally different world of electric lights and endless noise, people still use weed to feel calm, to slow down, to connect. It's like we've never really stopped doing what those ancient tribes started. We've just changed the tools. But let's go back even further. Way before 2500 BCE, the cannabis plant itself had already spread across the continents, carried by wind, animals, and humans who realized it was special. In China, around 4000 BCE, people were already cultivating it not to smoke yet, but to use every part of it. The fibers made strong ropes and clothes. The seeds were food. The oil was medicine. It was the perfect plant, useful, durable, and somehow mystical. Early Chinese texts mention cannabis as one of the 5 grains of immortality. That's how much they valued it. In fact, one of the oldest medical books in the world, attributed to the legendary Emperor Shen Nong, lists cannabis among sacred herbs. It was said to relieve pain, calm the mind, and open spiritual doors. And that's the thing. For ancient people, weed wasn't just a drug, it was a bridge. It connected them to the world around them, and to themselves. Life back then was hard. No safety nets, no medicine, no distraction from the grind of survival. A plant that could make you forget pain, help you sleep, or bring visions of another world. That was magic. Maybe that's why almost every ancient civilization eventually found it. In India, it became part of religion. In the Middle East, it was used by mystics and poets. In Africa, it became part of healing rituals. Humans everywhere kept rediscovering the same secret. This plant makes the world feel different. Maybe that's not an accident. You can almost picture that first tribe somewhere in Central Asia, staring at the stars after a long day, the cold creeping in, a small fire burning bright. Someone tosses dried cannabis flowers into the flames. A plume of smoke rises, thick and sweet. They lean closer, curiosity lighting up their faces. One takes a deep breath in, coughs, laughs, and suddenly, the world feels softer, the fire warmer, the stars closer, and that's it. A discovery that would echo across thousands of years. But for them, it wasn't just a high, it was holy. When you live in a world ruled by mystery and nature, where thunder is a god's voice and the wind is a spirit, something that changes how you see the world must come from the divine. So they built rituals around it. They burned it in ceremonies. They carried it to the afterlife, believing the smoke would guide their souls. Some of these early rituals have survived traces of their stories in myths. There are ancient legends of smoke that lets you talk to gods, of fire herbs that bring visions. The language is poetic because people didn't have scientific words for chemistry or THC. They just described what it felt like. And honestly, not much has changed. We still do that today. The words have changed, the science has evolved. But the reason, still the same. We're still curious, still seeking comfort, still chasing that feeling of being a little closer to something bigger than us. It's wild to think that one plant has traveled with humanity through every chapter of history, wars, empires, religions, revolutions, and it's still here, surviving, adapting. Even as we argued over it, banned it, praised it, and rediscovered it, cannabis stayed the same, just waiting for us to understand it again. So if you've ever thought weed was a modern thing, nah, it's prehistoric. It's ancient as the first drumbeat, as the first prayer. People were lighting up under the stars before there was even writing to record it. Maybe that's why it feels so natural. Because somewhere deep in our DNA, we remember. Imagine lying down tonight, closing your eyes, hearing the crackle of that old campfire thousands of years ago. The same stars above, the same quiet hum of night. Someone back then is doing the same thing, breathing in the same air, drifting into the same calm, thinking the same thought. The world feels kind of beautiful right now. And maybe, that's where it all began. Not with rebellion, not with culture, or law, or even medicine. Just a moment of peace, a breath of earth turned to smoke. A spark of curiosity that became one of humanity's oldest rituals. Because before it was a plant, before it was a substance, before it was a debate, which was simply a way to feel connected. So, imagine this. The fire's burning low, the stars stretch like spilled salt across the black sky, and the air smells faintly of earth and smoke. We're thousands of years before anything like modern civilization, and yet, somewhere in the distance, a drum begins to beat, slow, steady, like a heartbeat. The people gathering around that fire don't see it as smoke, they see it as spirit. They believe the world is full of unseen forces. Every river, mountain, and gust of wind has its own life, its own mood. And somewhere between the living world and the spirit world, there's a bridge, a thin veil that only opens when the air is heavy with something sacred. So they burn plants, they chant, they dance, and among those herbs, one plant always finds its way into the mix. It's funny to think about how weed became part of religion before it ever became part of recreation. For the ancient shamans, it wasn't about getting high, it was about opening a door. They believed that smoke was the breath of the gods rising, swirling, connecting the human soul to something far beyond understanding. And when they inhaled it, they weren't escaping reality, they were stepping into another layer of it. Early tribes across Central Asia, Siberia, and even what we now call Mongolia all shared this belief. Their shamans, or spirit talkers, were the people who carried the knowledge of herbs, fire, and trance. They were healers, storytellers, and guides. And when they needed to reach the unseen weather to heal someone, predict the weather, or call upon spirits, they burned cannabis. In some ways, they were the world's first explorers, not of land, but of consciousness, and their vehicle was smoke. Archaeologists have found stone and wooden bowls blackened by years of use, still holding traces of cannabis mixed with other plants. Some of these bowls were buried beside their owners, almost like ancient accessories for the afterlife, as if even after death, they'd need their tools to journey between worlds. And if you close your eyes for a second, you can almost picture it. A dark tent, lit by flickering firelight, the smell of herbs thick in the air, the shaman swaying, eyes half closed, chanting words that have no translation. Outside, snow falls softly on the grasslands. Inside, the air trembles with rhythm and smoke. It wasn't just Central Asia. Thousands of miles away, in what is now the Xinjiang region of China, Early Taoist practitioners also used cannabis as part of their spiritual rituals. The ancient Chinese believed the plant could help them communicate with the dead and see beyond the physical world. In early texts, cannabis was called ma, and it was said that if taken in excess, it lets one see ghosts, not a warning and invitation. It's strange how something so controversial today was once considered sacred. For those people, the plant was never evil, it was a teacher. It could show visions, pain, and bridge gaps between life and death. They treated it with respect, not suspicion. Meanwhile, further west, other cultures were discovering it too. The Indo-Iranians, nomadic people traveling across the steppes, used cannabis in their religious ceremonies dedicated to their god of fire, Agni. They burned it in great fires, called halma or soma rituals, believing the smoke carried prayers up to the heavens. There's this poetic logic to it. Smoke rises, right? So if you wanted your message to reach the sky, the best way was to send it through smoke. It's like an ancient version of sending an email to the gods, only way cooler and a lot more aromatic. Then came the Scythians, the wild horse-riding warriors of the steppe, who might just be history's first confirmed hotboxers. Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote about them in the 5th century BCE. He said that after funerals, the Scythians would crawl into small tents, toss hemp seeds on red-hot stones, and inhale the smoke. They howl in their joy. He wrote, "Imagine being the first historian to describe a hotbox." Now, maybe Herodotus exaggerated, maybe he didn't, but the archaeological finds back him up. In ancient Scythian tombs, Kurgan's archaeologists found gold cups coated with traces of cannabis and opium. So yeah, turns out, they were probably partying and praying. But again, this wasn't a casual hangout. This was ritual. To the Scythians, life and death were one circle. When someone important died, they believed the spirit needed help crossing over. The smoke was a guide, a companion, maybe even a protection against the shadows between worlds. And here's what's fascinating: every culture that discovered cannabis gave it a meaning that fit their world. To the Chinese, it was medicine and magic. To the Scythians, a ritual of death and purification. To the shamans, a way to touch the divine. Humans always wrapped this plant in mystery, as if deep down they knew there was more to it than simple chemistry. Thousands of miles away, in the Indus Valley and early Vedic India, people were crafting hymns to a divine drink called soma. We don't know exactly what soma was. Could have been a mix of many plants, but some scholars think cannabis played a part. And later, as Hinduism evolved, the use of banga cannabis drink became tied to worship of the god Shiva. Shiva, the ascetic god who meditates in the Himalayas, was said to rest under cannabis plants and drink bang to focus his mind. So even thousands of years ago, people saw weed as something that helped you go inward. It wasn't just about escape, it was about awareness. Picture those early Indian holy men sitting by the river, chanting mantras, eyes half-lidded, smoke rising from clay pipes. The air hums with peace. They believed the herb helped quiet the chaos of thought, opened the gates of wisdom, and brought them closer to truth. And then, slowly, through trade routes, that knowledge spread. The Silk Road wasn't just for silk and spices, it carried ideas, stories, and seeds. Travelers and merchants moved between China, India, Persia, and the Mediterranean, and along with gold and fabric, they shared something much simpler: a handful of dried leaves that could change the way you see the world. Imagine being a traveler in those times. You stop at a caravanserai after a long day crossing the desert. You sit around a small fire with strangers from far-off lands. One of them pulls out a pouch, tosses something fragrant onto the coals. A thick, sweet smoke curls into the night. No one speaks for a moment. Everyone just breathes and feels lighter. That's how cultures mix quietly, around fires, under the same sky. And in that way, weed became not just a ritual tool, but a universal language. No matter the country, no matter the language, people understood the same thing. This plant changes something inside you. It connects you to others. It slows the world down. Even in early African tribes, cannabis became a central part of ceremonies. The Pygmies, the Hottentots, and later, Bantu-speaking people used it in rituals and medicine. They believed the smoke could ward off evil, heal the sick, and bring luck before hunting. In some cultures, a pipe of cannabis was passed around as a symbol of peace. No contract, no paper, just a shared moment of calm. And maybe that's why weed has always survived, no matter how many times humans tried to suppress it. Because it speaks to something deep and human, the need to pause, to breathe, to connect. It's older than laws, older than countries, older than fear. If you trace the trail of smoke across history, it always leads to the same place. People seeking balance. Some call it God, some call it peace, some just call it a good night's sleep. But the feeling is always the same. So when we talk about the ancient roots of cannabis, we're really talking about ourselves. About that universal curiosity, the desire to touch the mystery that hides just beyond sight. The same curiosity that made ancient shamans throw herbs into fire is the one that makes modern people stare at stars, wondering what else is out there. Because humans have always been dreamers, we've always wanted to see beyond the edge, and maybe, just maybe, cannabis has been our companion on that journey longer than any of us realize. It's not just history, it's memory. When the world was still young and the great rivers of Asia carried both traders and tales, a quiet transformation was happening far to the south, in a place where the air shimmered with heat and the smell of incense clung to the temples. India had already begun to build its myths, gods that danced, mountains that spoke, and rivers that remembered prayers. In this world of rhythm and ritual, cannabis found a home unlike any other. It didn't sneak in as a forbidden pleasure. It arrived as a guest of the divine. By the time the oldest Vedic hymns were sung, verses whispered to the rising sun and the crackling of sacred fires, people were already calling cannabis by a name that carried respect, bang, and they didn't see it as a plant. They saw it as a gift. The legend says that one day, as the gods and demons churned the ocean of milk in search of immortality, poison spilled from the depths and threatened to destroy creation. To save the world, the god Shiva drank the poison, his throat turning blue from its burn. And to soothe that fire, he rested beneath a tall green plant, cannabis, whose leaves cooled his body and calmed his mind. From then on, it was said that the plant was his favorite. It's strange how myth can make something sacred. For the followers of Shiva, bang became more than a drink. It was a doorway. They'd grind the leaves into paste, mix it with milk, nuts, and spices, and drink it during festivals. Holy Mahashivratri, all moments when color, music, and joy blended into one long exhale. For them, the herb didn't take you away from the world. It pulled you deeper into it. Even today, if you wander through the ghats of Varanasi, that ancient city where the Ganges whispers against the stone steps, you'll see holy men, sadhis, wrapped in saffron cloth, their hair coiled into long locks, sitting cross-legged with a small clay pipe in hand. They light it slowly, whispering Shiva's name with each puff, Boom Shankar. And then they sit still, eyes half open, half closed, somewhere between dream and prayer. It's not about escape, it's about silence, about letting the mind become as calm as the river. And there's something deeply human about that, isn't there? This search for stillness. It's what connects a sadhu in India to a monk in Tibet, to a poet in Persia, to someone sitting in a quiet room halfway across the world just trying to breathe. And it wasn't just the spiritual ones. Ancient Indian doctors, the Ayurvedic practitioners, wrote about cannabis in their texts thousands of years ago. They called it Vijaya, meaning victory. It was used to treat pain, fevers, indigestion, and even as an anesthetic. In those times, medicine and magic weren't enemies. They were the same thing, understanding the world's hidden rhythms and working with them. So in India, cannabis became both medicine and meditation, something to heal the body and free the mind. And that duality, sacred yet practical, spiritual yet everyday, might be the reason it survived for so long here. But India wasn't the only place where we'd became part of the sacred. Further west, across the deserts and trade routes, another transformation was taking place. As caravans crossed the Persian plateau, carrying spices, gems, and silks, they also carried something much lighter, seeds, tiny, brown, unremarkable things that held a kind of quiet revolution. When those seeds reached Persia and the lands beyond, they found poets, and poets, more than anyone, understood the beauty of altered perception. By the time of the medieval Islamic Golden Age, cannabis had become known in the Middle East as hashish. It wasn't smoked at first, it was eaten, mixed with honey, or made into a soft, fragrant paste. And in that region, something unexpected happened. It became a language of rebellion, of mysticism, of laughter. The world then was ruled by empires and strict moral codes. Alcohol was forbidden. indulgence was frowned upon. But in the shadows of the cities, in small rooms filled with music and poetry, people found a different kind of joy. They'd pass around hashish, recite verses, talk about love, God, and madness. It wasn't a sin to them, it was exploration. And from those nights of smoke and words came one of the most famous groups in history, the Sufis. The Sufis weren't just religious people, they were seekers, mystics, who believed that God wasn't found in books or temples, but within the heart. They danced, they sang, they laughed. They believed love was the only truth. And some of them, not all, but some used hashish to reach that state of divine intoxication. To them, the idea was simple. If your mind could quiet down, if the ego could fade, you could touch something infinite. The poet Rumi wrote about that kind of ecstasy, though he never mentioned hashish directly. His words carry that same rhythm of surrender. Lose yourself completely. Return to the root of your own soul. There's a kind of poetry in that, isn't there? How a plant that grows from the ground could make people look up at the stars and feel closer to heaven. But, as always, not everyone saw it that way. Even in ancient times, we'd had its critics. Some rulers tried to ban it, claiming it made men lazy or sinful. Scholars debated its place in law and religion. Yet no matter how many times it was outlawed, it found a way to grow in gardens, in fields, in secret corners of hearts that longed for peace. And every time someone tried to silence it, a poet somewhere would write a verse in its defense. One old Persian saying goes, "Hashish is the key to laughter and the gate to wisdom." Not bad for something that starts as a seed. Meanwhile, across the Red Sea and deep into Africa, cannabis was finding new meanings. Traders from Arabia carried it southward. It took root in Ethiopia, then spread through the valleys and plains to Central and Southern Africa. By the time it reached the Bantu-speaking tribes, it had already become part of life. In Africa, it wasn't seen as foreign. It blended naturally into existing traditions. People used it in medicine, in rituals of healing, and in ceremonies of unity. Before important councils, leaders would share a pipe as a sign of peace, a silent agreement, sealed not with ink, but with breath. Among the Zulu, it was smoked before battle to build courage. Among the Hottentots, it was offered to the sick to ease pain. And among the Shona and Sotho, it was used by diviners who believed the smoke helped them hear the voices of ancestors. Different lands, different languages, same idea. Smoke connects worlds, and it's almost eerie how consistent that belief is. Whether in a Himalayan cave, a Persian garden, or an African village, humans kept finding the same truth hidden in the same leaf, that the mind could open wider than the body, that the unseen was not so far away. If you trace all these stories from the mountains of China to the plains of Africa, it's clear that cannabis wasn't some isolated discovery. It was like a song humanity kept rediscovering in every generation, in every tongue. A plant that calmed the restless heart, eased the ache of living, and reminded people of beauty. Maybe that's why, even when empires fell, when kings turned to dust, when religions rose and crumbled, the smoke never stopped rising. Tonight, if you close your eyes, you can almost feel that lineage, a line of hands passing the same spark across centuries, each one lighting the next. A shaman in the cold steppe, a priest by the Ganges, a poet in a Persian courtyard, a healer in an African hut, all sharing something wordless, ancient, and human. And maybe that's what weed has always been. Not rebellion, not medicine, not sin, just connection. A green thread weaving through history, reminding us that even in the oldest stories, people were already searching for the same peace we still chase today. Because some truths don't age, they just pass through smoke and time, waiting to be remembered. Centuries slipped by, and the world began to change slowly, unevenly, as it always does. People learned to smelt metal, build cities, write laws, and argue about who owns which patch of dirt. Yet somewhere in between all that progress, they still made time to sit by a fire, pass around some fragrant smoke, and stare dreamily at the stars. Maybe they weren't calling it weed yet, but the ritual was already ancient, older than most gods, older than most languages. Archaeologists digging around the high plateaus of Central Asia found traces of cannabis in burial mounds, charred seeds, a little residue still clinging to the clay. The dates, somewhere around 2500 BCE. Think about that, 5,000 years ago. Someone packed a bowl well, more like a wooden brazier, and burned cannabis for a funeral ceremony. That person didn't know what electricity was, or iron, or the internet. but they knew how to get a little high while sending a loved one to the next world. The Scythians, nomadic horsemen who roamed the Eurasian steppe, were particularly famous for it. Herodotus, that ancient gossip who wrote down everything he saw and plenty he didn't, described them throwing hemp seeds on hot stones inside little tents. Imagine that scene, a circle of warriors, naked, sweating in a tiny hide-covered sauna, smoke swirling thick enough to blur their tattooed skin. Herodotus said they howl with joy, which is such a poetic way of saying they were probably absolutely blasted. Those Scythians might be the ancestors of every stoner who ever thought hotboxing was a brilliant idea. But to them, it wasn't about a lazy weekend, it was ritual, purification, and maybe communion with spirits. It's funny how so many cultures stumbled onto the same thing. Take a plant, burn it, inhale the smoke, and suddenly reality feels softer around the edges. Further east, ancient Chinese healers were already cataloging cannabis in their herbal texts. The Pen Sao Qing, attributed to Emperor Shennong, mentioned hemp as both a medicine and a mystical substance. They used the seeds for food, the stalks for cloth, and the resin for rituals. A plant that could clothe, feed, and calm you. It's no wonder they saw it as a divine gift. Then there were the Indians. Oh, they didn't just smoke it, they worshipped it. Cannabis, known as bhang, was said to be a favorite of Lord Shiva himself, the great ascetic god who danced the universe into existence. During festivals, people would mix bhang into milk, spices, and honey, drink it, and slip into a slow, sacred haze. Some holy men even claimed that through cannabis, they could quiet the body and open the mind to divine truth. In the Middle East, ancient Assyrians had words for it too. Their tablets called it kubu, which sounds suspiciously like cannabis, and they burned it in temples as incense. Later, the Persians carried it along their trade routes, mixing it with other herbs for medicine and magic. Every civilization that met this plant found its own way of using it, naming it, and explaining why it mattered. What's wild is how universal it all feels. No matter where you look in a frozen Scythian camp, a Chinese apothecary, or an Indian temple, people were chasing the same strange feeling. Maybe it wasn't even about getting high. Maybe it was about escaping the ordinary for a while. When your world is hard and your gods feel distant, sometimes a little smoke between your fingers feels like a bridge. As centuries rolled on, cannabis followed the paths of trade and conquest. The Silk Road wasn't just carrying silk and spices, it was trafficking ideas, religions, and yes, the occasional bundle of fragrant herbs. Traders and travelers swapped more than goods, they shared habits. Maybe a Persian merchant showed a Kushan monk how to pack a pipe. Maybe a wandering healer passed a handful of seeds to a caravan guard who took them west. The plant spread like a whisper, following human restlessness, and along the way, it adapted. In warmer, wetter climates, it grew taller and resinous. In cold mountain valleys, it became shorter, tougher, and more aromatic. People began to breed it without knowing they were breeding it, selecting the strains that smelled stronger, hit harder, or soothed better. Cannabis, in its quiet green way, evolved alongside humanity. There's something poetic about that, isn't there? As humans were figuring out fire, writing, agriculture, and religion, this little plant was evolving right next to them, helping them think, dream, relax, or maybe just forget for a while. By the time the classical empires rose, the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, weed had already been around longer than civilization itself. The Egyptians used hemp fibers for rope and linen, but their priests probably knew the smoky side of it too. Some of their temple mixtures, used for communion with the gods, contained ingredients that could easily have included cannabis resin. The ancient Greeks, for their part, weren't shy about describing it as medicine. The historian Diodorus wrote that Scythians used the vapor for pleasure, while Greek physicians boiled the seeds to treat inflammation and pain. Even in those polished marble societies, people still liked a good smoke. They might not have framed it as rebellion, more like healing, purification, or divine contact, but the essence was the same. Change your mind by changing your breath. By now, thousands of years had passed since that first unknown ancestor lit the first bowl under the night sky. Civilizations had risen and fallen, gods had come and gone, and yet, somewhere, someone was still burning cannabis and exhaling into history. The world had changed, but that simple act, taking a plant and setting it aflame, was still one of the most human things we could do. And that's the funny part, it never really went away. it just waited. Hidden in temples, buried in tombs, whispered about in rituals, weed had already become something more than a plant. It was a memory of warmth, smoke, laughter, and a little peace in a hard world. Maybe that's why, when archaeologists sift through ancient ash and find those tiny blackened seeds, it feels like finding a trace of ourselves, proof that even 5,000 years ago, people weren't so different. They worked, they fought, they loved, they grieved, and sometimes they just wanted to relax for a minute. And in that way, the story of weed isn't just about history, it's about being human, about our endless search for calm, connection, and a little moment of escape. Long before anyone rolled a joint or passed a lighter, someone sat by a fire, took a deep breath, and drifted into that same gentle place we still chase today. As the smoke drifted westward, it clung to trade routes like a secret perfume, soft, invisible, but impossible to forget. The Silk Road wasn't a single road, but 1,000 dusty paths stretching from China to the Mediterranean, carrying everything from jade to philosophy, silk to gunpowder. And somewhere among those treasures was a simple green herb that would quietly reshape human history. Merchants didn't write about it in their ledgers. It wasn't exactly legal, and it wasn't exactly contraband either. It was something in between, something spiritual, medicinal, and a little mischievous. By the time the caravans reached Egypt, cannabis had already found a second home. The Egyptians had a way of blending the sacred and the sensual so effortlessly that it made sense for a plant like this to fit right in. There are whispers in the medical papyri, those faded scrolls of ink and prayer, of remedies that sound suspiciously like cannabis concoctions. One ancient recipe for easing sorrow mentions a plant that gladdens the heart. Another lists ingredients to calm pain and induce rest. The Egyptians were no fools. They knew how to blend plants for both body and spirit. In the temples, priests burned resins and herbs during ceremonies that filled the halls with smoke so thick it looked like sunlight made visible. Incense was more than just a smell, it was a bridge between worlds. And in that haze, who's to say there wasn't a little cannabis hidden among the frankincense and myrrh? Maybe the gods of Egypt got their prayers with a faint whiff of something extra. Down the Nile, people used hemp fibers for rope, sails, and linen, everyday materials spun from the same plant that might have been used to dream. It's a strange duality. The same stalk that hauled stone for pyramids might also have carried souls to heaven. That's the magic of cannabis. It can be both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. But Egypt wasn't alone. Across the Red Sea, in the Horn of Africa, the plant found new life in trade towns that smelled of salt, spice, and smoke. The early Ethiopians and Somalis traded with the Arabs and Persians long before anyone wrote about it. And some of those exchanges almost certainly included the seeds of hemp. In East Africa, it became part of local medicine and ritual, used by healers who sang to the spirits before crushing the leaves. And then there were the Greeks. The Greeks loved a good debate, a good drink, and apparently a good smoke too. They borrowed the habit from their Scythian neighbors, those same horsemen who liked to hotbox their tents. Greek writers described cannabis being used to soothe wounds and ease the pain of childbirth. Soldiers might rub hemp oil on their bodies to heal after battle, not realizing they were absorbing something far more powerful than a simple bomb. Some even say the philosopher who claimed everything was made of fire might have known a thing or two about staring into the flame until the world felt a little too alive. Of course, there's no proof he smoked anything, but if he did, well, everything flows starts to sound like something you'd say. Mid-session. By the time the Romans took over the Mediterranean, cannabis had become a quiet companion of civilization. Roman doctors used it in poultices and tinctures. Farmers grew it for rope and cloth. The empire that built roads and aqueducts also built fields of hemp stretching across Europe. Yet even then, the plant carried a strange aura. It was practical, yes, but also mysterious. Some Roman cults, especially those devoted to mystery rites, burned herbs in darkened rooms to summon visions. Not all of them admitted what went into those mixtures. As the Roman Empire spread, so did the knowledge of the plant. Soldiers, traders, and wanderers carried seeds in their pouches and stories in their heads. They crossed into Gaul, into Germania and beyond, into lands where the air was colder and the nights were long. Hemp thrived there too, growing wild along riverbanks and pastures. It became part of daily life, woven into rope, pressed into oil, and occasionally, set aflame. In Africa, the story took a slightly different turn. Cannabis entered through multiple doors from the Middle East, from India, from the coastlines of trade. In Egypt and Nubia, it mingled with older traditions of trance and divination. In sub-Saharan Africa, it took on a more rhythmic role. People would gather in circles, drums beating like a second heart, smoke drifting up to meet the stars. The ritual wasn't just about the plant, it was about connection, to the ancestors, to the earth, to each other. Some tribes believed the smoke could carry messages to the dead. Others thought it brought the dead closer to the living. Either way, the act of smoking became a bridge, a conversation between worlds that needed no words. And still, all of this happened without anyone thinking of weed the way we do now. There were no joints, no rolling papers, no chill playlists. It wasn't about escaping responsibility. It was about understanding the universe in a softer way. To these early users, the plant wasn't rebellion, it was revelation. But where there's revelation, control soon follows. Empires, priests, and kings never liked things that opened minds too much. Knowledge, after all, is power. An altered perception can be dangerous in the wrong hands. So, as the ancient world turned medieval, the story of cannabis took a darker path. What had once been sacred became suspicious. What had once connected people to the divine began to be labeled as unholy. The same smoke that priests once offered to the gods began to look, to new rulers and new religions, like a threat. And soon, that quiet green plant that had followed humanity from the mountains of Asia to the deserts of Africa would face the first flickers of fear and control. But before we reach that part of the story, the burning, the banning, the centuries of secrecy, there's still one more chapter of wonder, because just before the Middle Ages drew their curtains, the world saw one of the most fascinating transformations in the plant's journey, the meeting of cannabis and Islam, and the rise of a whole new culture built around smoke, poetry, and divine peace. When the first muezzins called out from new-built minarets across the sands, their voices echoing in the dawn, the world had just shifted into a new rhythm. Islam was spreading across Arabia, weaving distant tribes into one faith, one language, one way of life. But as the caravans rolled under the desert sun, they carried more than just the word of God. In their packs were spices, silk, stories, and, quietly, the seeds of an old plant that had already passed through half the world. Cannabis had been around the Arabian Peninsula long before the Prophet's message. Traders from Persia and India had been bringing it for centuries, selling it in the spice markets of Mecca and Medina. At first, it was just another plant, another tool for medicine, rope, or ritual. But after Islam took root, the way people thought about pleasure, purity, and intoxication changed. The Quran forbade wine and drunkenness, clear enough, but it said nothing about this curious green herb that didn't come from a grape or a still. And so, a debate began. Scholars argued, imams debated, poets experimented. Some said cannabis was fine, because it didn't cloud the mind like alcohol, it opened it. Others warned it was just another trick of the devil, a way to escape discipline and prayer. But arguments like that rarely stop anyone curious enough to try something new. By the 9th and 10th centuries, cannabis, especially in the form of hashish, had found its way into the heart of Islamic culture. In the cities of Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus, poets and mystics gathered in smoky courtyards to discuss life, death, and the divine. They weren't just getting high, they were chasing God through a haze of laughter and philosophy. The Sufis, Islam's wandering mystics, had a special relationship with hashish. They believed that everything in the world was a reflection of divine love, and that sometimes, to truly see it, you had to silence the ordinary world. Cannabis became, for some, a shortcut to that silence. Under its influence, they said, music sounded like prayer, and the universe seemed to hum with hidden order. It wasn't a drug, it was a doorway. There are old tales about Sufi saints who would sit for hours, eyes half closed, smiling faintly as if the wind were whispering secrets just to them. They called hashish the herb of understanding. Others saw it as a test of faith. If you could handle the insight it gave, without losing your humility, then you were truly close to God. But if it made you arrogant, lazy, or lost in illusion, then you had failed the test. It wasn't about the smoke, it was about what you saw through it. Meanwhile, the common people found their own uses for it. Laborers and farmers in Egypt chewed on hashish to make the day pass faster, to dull hunger, to make the fields shimmer in a way that made work feel lighter. In taverns and tea-houses, storytellers would spin tales as smoke drifted overhead, their words bending and blooming with every puff. It was social, communal, a slow rebellion against the weight of the world. Not everyone was pleased. As the centuries rolled on, rulers began to see hashish not as holy but as dangerous. Around the 13th century, the Mamluk sultans in Cairo cracked down on it. They claimed it made people lazy, distracted, and disobedient. One sultan even ordered that all cannabis plants be uprooted and burned, and that anyone caught eating hashish would have his teeth pulled out. But prohibition has never worked well on something that grows so easily and feels so good. The people went right on planting it, right on smoking it, right on passing it around in quiet corners. And in Persia, things took an even stranger turn. There, in mountain fortresses and shadowed gardens, the legend of the assassins began to form. Western chroniclers, especially the Crusaders who couldn't tell myth from gossip, claimed that these secret warriors used hashish before carrying out their missions, that they were given a taste of paradise to make them fearless in battle. It's where the word assassin supposedly comes from. Hashashin, the hashish-eaters. Whether or not that story is true hardly matters. It stuck. It painted cannabis as both sacred and dangerous, a plant that could awaken vision or madness depending on who held it. The West began to whisper about it as something exotic, mysterious, and a little terrifying. But in the East, it stayed what it had always been, part of life. From the bazaars of Cairo to the gardens of Shiraz, people continued to light their pipes, watch the world soften at the edges, and talk about things that made no sense and perfect sense at the same time. Philosophers called it contemplation. Lovers called it poetry. The poor called it relief. Everyone had a name for it, but everyone understood the same thing. It made life a little gentler, a little slower, a little more bearable, and yet, the paradox remained. Islam, as a faith, emphasized sobriety, clarity, and self-control. The plant, meanwhile, invited surrender, softness, and laughter. Somehow, they coexisted. Perhaps that's because life, even in its most devout forms, always leaves room for contradiction. The same man who prayed 5 times a day might still share a pipe after sunset. The same scholar who condemned it in public might have kept a little pouch hidden in his study. By the late medieval period, cannabis had become deeply woven into the fabric of Islamic society. It was sold in markets, sung about in poems, and debated in sermons. It crossed class lines and moral boundaries with the ease of smoke slipping through a curtain. It belonged to no one and everyone. But as Europe began to wake from its own dark centuries, its explorers and traders started peering into this world of smoke and stories with hungry curiosity. They didn't yet understand what they were seeing. To them, hashish was just another strange custom of the East, like the spices, the veils, the call to prayer. They wrote about it in travelogues with a mix of fascination and fear. And soon, they would bring that fascination home. When the ships began to sail back west, carrying silk, gold, and ideas, they also carried tales of a plant that could calm the body and expand the mind. Europe, still stiff with religion and repression, wasn't quite ready for it yet, but the seed had been planted, literally and metaphorically. When cannabis first drifted into medieval Europe, it didn't arrive with fanfare or smoke. It came quietly, in sacks of fiber and seed. The traders who carried it across the Mediterranean saw it mostly as a crop, a tool, a way to spin ropes strong enough to hold the sails of ships or the armor of knights. The Europeans, always practical, looked at the plant and saw work, not wonder, and yet, that quiet green plant had a way of slipping under the skin of civilization. It didn't need a revolution to take root. It just needed soil. In monasteries, monks grew hemp by the acre. They spun it into cords, parchment, and clothing. Some of those monks may have discovered other uses too. There are scattered notes in herbal manuscripts, recipes for oils, poultices, and relaxing draughts. They called it cannabis or hennep, and they said it softens the sinews and brings ease to the troubled mind. It wasn't framed as pleasure, it was medicine, a mercy granted by God through the gifts of the earth. And yet, when you read those lines, you can almost hear the undertone of someone who understood what a few drops of that oil could really do. After a long day of copying manuscripts by candlelight, the Middle Ages were not kind to the body or the mind. Cold stone walls, hard labor, plagues, hunger, endless sermons. It's no wonder people searched for ways to feel something gentler. For most, that meant wine or ale. But in the hidden corners of Europe, in the convent gardens and apothecaries, the midwives' cupboards and herbalists' shops, there were always other options. Hemp grew like a weed, and from its leaves and flowers came salves for wounds, tinctures for sleep, and sometimes whispers of something that eased, not just pain but the soul. There was a kind of double life to cannabis in those times. On the one hand, it was everywhere, woven into sails that carried crusaders to the Holy Land, wrapped around the ropes of church bells, pressed into the oil that lit the altars. On the other hand, its psychoactive side remained a secret, half known, half feared. In the Christian world, anything that altered consciousness was viewed with suspicion. The church wanted discipline, obedience, order, but cannabis didn't care about order. It brought softness, introspection, laughter. It made people feel close to creation in a way that didn't require a priest, and that was always dangerous. Still, it survived. In the folk traditions that the church could never quite crush, peasants used it for everything from joint pain to childbirth to sleeplessness. Old women, the ones later branded as witches, kept their recipes hidden in memory rather than on paper. A little hemp oil for the swelling, a bit of dried flour in hot water for calm. Sometimes they'd burn it in rituals, saying it carried prayers faster. When the Inquisition came, they burned the women instead. But history moves in circles, not lines. While Europe was tightening its moral belt, other corners of the world were still breathing freely. In India, cannabis remained holy. In Africa, it was still woven into music and healing. In the Middle East, despite the bans, the scent of hashish drifted through cities every night, and eventually, through war, trade, and exploration, Europe couldn't help but inhale some of that air again. The Crusades brought back more than relics and stories. They brought back contact with the East Knights who had marched through Palestine, and Syria returned home with strange tales. Men who smoked herbs that made them laugh, dream, and forget fear. Most Europeans didn't know what to make of it. Some thought it was magic, others heresy. But for a few curious minds, it was an invitation. By the Renaissance, Europe was rediscovering curiosity itself. Scholars were translating Arabic medical texts, alchemists were testing the boundaries of what nature could offer, and explorers were bringing home plants the old world had never seen before. Cannabis, still called hemp, in most places was everywhere in the background. It was a vital crop, as important as wheat or flax. But here and there, in the margins of old herbals, you start to see hints that people were remembering what it could really do. One English herbal from the 1500s mentions that hemp consumes humours and bringeth delight to those of melancholy. Nature, that's a poetic way of saying it can lift a mood, isn't it? Physicians wrote about it for gout, for madness, for sorrow, and somewhere between those medical notes and the smoke-filled taverns, the line between healing and pleasure began to blur again. Europe was changing. Science was waking up. The church was losing its absolute grip. The world was getting bigger, sailing ships, spinning wheels, new lands to conquer, and all of it depended, quite literally, on hemp. Without it, the sails wouldn't rise, the ropes would snap, the world would stay small. The very plant that had once carried people into trance was now carrying them across oceans. And that's where things took an unexpected turn, because when European ships began to touch the coasts of Africa, India, and eventually the Americas, they didn't just bring conquests, they brought exchange. And with every exchange came new ways of seeing, smoking, and dreaming. The sailors who loaded those ships might have shared a pipe with Indian dockworkers or North African traders. Maybe one of them tucked a few seeds into a pocket, thinking it might be useful in the new world. What they didn't realize was that they were carrying an ancient passenger. The same plant that had traveled with nomads across Asia and priests through Egypt was now crossing the Atlantic, ready to start its next chapter. But before we reach the colonies and the great age of exploration, there's a moment in history worth pausing on, a quiet intersection of old Europe and the world beyond. It's the 1600s, and the age of discovery has begun. The sails are made of hemp, the ropes are hemp, the paper the explorers write on is hemp. The plant is literally holding civilization together. And yet, somewhere below decks, in the smoky quarters of sailors and servants, someone is rolling up the same plant for a very different reason. They're lighting it for warmth, for comfort, maybe for the simple pleasure of breathing something that isn't salt air. And as the smoke drifts toward the ceiling of those wooden ships, it carries with it 5,000 years of human history, a thread of calm running through the chaos of progress. By the time Europe began to stretch its reach across the oceans, the plant had already been everywhere, but this was the first time it would cross the seas in chains, sails, and whispers. When the ships left their harbors for the coasts of Africa and the Caribbean, they carried two very different cargoes: dreams of empire and the weight of human suffering. Hemp was part of both. Its fibers bound the ships together, its ropes tied the masts, its sails caught the wind. Without hemp, the empires of Europe would never have moved at all. But tucked into those same ships, along with the people forced aboard, came something older and freer: the seeds of cannabis itself. It began in the holds of Portuguese and Spanish vessels. In the early 1500s, traders and colonizers brought the plant to Africa first, not as a luxury, but as a crop. Hemp rope, hemp fabricate was as practical as it was profitable. But Afrikaans already knew something about smoke, trance, and rhythm. When cannabis found its way into their hands, it wasn't a tool anymore. It became part of a ritual. On the western coast, where people were captured and loaded onto ships, cannabis took root as part of the sorrow and survival that defined those years. It grew in secret fields behind huts, smoked during ceremonies, shared in the spaces between fear and memory. When enslaved Africans were forced across the Atlantic, some carried seeds braided into their hair, hidden in clothes, tucked in small pouches. It was a quiet defiance, one more piece of home to take into the unknown. And when they reached the Caribbean and the Americas, the seeds grew again. In Jamaica, the plant flourished in the island heat, loved by the soil and the sun. Enslaved workers used it to ease the pain of long days in the cane fields, to sleep when the body refused, to forget when forgetting was the only mercy left. The overseers didn't care what they smoked, as long as the work was done. They didn't understand that in those moments of smoke and silence, something human was being preserved. In South America, Spanish settlers cultivated hemp for rope and cloth, while indigenous peoples, already familiar with ritual smoke from tobacco and other sacred plants, began to mix cannabis into their own ceremonies. The two traditions met and merged. Smoke became both resistance and prayer. In a world built on domination, a simple breath of cannabis was an act of quiet rebellion, reminder that the body still belonged to itself. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the plant was living a double life. It was praised by governments as an economic staple grown in Russia, France, and England by the ton to make naval rope and uniforms, but its psychoactive side remained buried in rumor. The sailors, though knew, they'd light up at sea, swapping stories from India, Africa, and the islands, laughing as the stars spun above the deck. They didn't call it weed or hashish. It was just something to pass the time, something that made the endless blue stretch a little less lonely. By the 1600s and 1700s, hemp was so essential that kings issued decrees ordering farmers to grow it. Even in the New World, the colonies depended on it. Virginia, Massachusetts, and Connecticut all had laws requiring hemp cultivation. George Washington grew it. So did Thomas Jefferson. Their diaries mention harvesting, curing, and processing it, though whether they ever smoked it remains a mystery. History, as always, leaves room for imagination. But the thing about empire is that it never stays simple. Every plant that crossed an ocean came back with stories and fears. European travelers who had seen cannabis used in India and North Africa began writing about it in strange, almost moralistic tones. They called it the intoxicating herb, the Arab madness. They described men in bazaars lost in laughter, women singing through clouds of smoke, holy men swaying in trance. It fascinated them and frightened them. They couldn't understand how something that made people so peaceful could also feel so powerful. That fear simmered quietly for centuries, until the modern age arrived, the age of science, medicine, and colonization's last great wave. In the 19th century, British doctors in India began studying cannabis for its medical potential. They were amazed. They wrote of its ability to numb pain, ease nausea, and calm seizures. One famous doctor, William O'Shaughnessy, called it a plant of remarkable power and introduced it to Western medicine. Soon, cannabis extracts were being sold in pharmacies across Europe and America. Tinctures, tonics, painkillers, all labeled perfectly respectable. For a brief moment, cannabis was legal, medical, and admired. It was prescribed for headaches, cramps, insomnia, and melancholy. Victorian ladies took it discreetly. Artists and poets Baudelaire, Gautier, the members of the Club des Hachishins in Paris, celebrated it as a doorway to imagination. They met in candlelit rooms, drinking coffee laced with green resin, describing visions of color and sound that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of reality. To them, cannabis wasn't sinful or sublime, but like all things that give freedom, it soon drew suspicion. Industrial powers didn't like what they couldn't control. Churches didn't like pleasure without penance. And governments, especially those trying to manage colonies, saw cannabis as a sign of disorder. In India and the Caribbean, colonial authorities began to blame hashish and ganja for rebellion, laziness, and native unrest. The plant that had sailed the world on European ships was now being criminalized by the very empires that once depended on it. Still, it refused to disappear. In Jamaica, cannabis merged with local culture and belief, becoming the sacrament of Rastafari centuries later. In Mexico, it grew wild in the hills and fields, smoked by laborers and revolutionaries. In the southern United States, it lingered on plantations and small farms, passing quietly from worker to worker, story to story. The plant had outlasted gods, kings, crusades, and conquests. It had survived the cold of Europe, the heat of Africa, the fires of empire. Every time someone tried to bury it, it grew back. Every time someone outlawed it, it found another border to cross. And now, as the 20th century loomed on the horizon, machines roaring, cities swelling, the world spinning faster than ever, the old plant was about to find itself in the center of a new war. Not a war of nations, but of perception. By the early 1900s, the world was addicted to progress. Smoke poured out of factories, cities glowed with electric light, and humanity congratulated itself for conquering almost everything except its own fears. Science was everywhere now, defining what was rational and what wasn't. Anything that didn't fit the new image of productivity and order was seen as suspicious. Cannabis, with its dreamy calm and ancient soul, didn't fit anywhere in this new mechanical rhythm. It was too slow, too human, too unpredictable. In Mexico and the American Southwest, workers still smoked it after long back-breaking days in the fields or mines. Soldiers used it to steady their nerves, poets to spark their thoughts. But in the United States, something was changing. The early 20th century was an age of moral panic, an age that wanted everything clean, proper, and efficient. Alcohol was demonized first, but soon the attention turned to other intoxicants. The newspapers began to whisper about a new, dangerous drug coming from Mexico. They called it marijuana, a word chosen carefully, foreign-sounding enough to create fear. The same plant that had been in apothecaries under its Latin name, cannabis sativa, suddenly became the enemy. Articles screamed about degenerate weed fiends and mad crimes caused by the drug. It didn't matter that most of it was exaggerated nonsense. The panic worked. Fear always sells better than truth. Behind the headlines, politics played its usual games. Industrial tycoons who owned paper, textiles, and synthetic materials saw hemp as competition. The oil barons and chemical giants wanted the future to belong to plastics, not plants. A smear campaign began connecting cannabis to crime, madness, and racial prejudice. In the 1930s, Harry Anslinger, head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, became its loudest voice. He called cannabis the assassin of youth and claimed it could turn men into monsters. He didn't care about science. He cared about control. Anslinger used the racial tensions of the time to push his agenda, associating cannabis with black jazz musicians and Mexican laborers, painting their culture and creativity as a threat. The same music that made the world dance was suddenly evidence of moral decay. And so came the reefer madness era, a strange, hysterical campaign where propaganda films showed clean-cut teenagers turning into criminals after a single puff. It was absurd, but it worked. In 1937, the US passed the Marijuana Tax Act, effectively criminalizing cannabis. Other countries followed. Overnight, the plant that had served humanity for thousands of years became contraband. Its name became a whisper again, just like it had been in the old temples of India and Egypt, only now it was whispered out of fear, and yet it didn't die. The thing about cannabis is that it's patient. It waits. It grows quietly in the shadows until the world needs it again. By the 1940s and 50s, it was still alive in small, hidden corners in the smoky backrooms of jazz clubs, in the poetry of the beat generation, in the dreams of people who couldn't stand the world's endless noise. They found peace in that small act of rebellion, a breath of stillness in an age of conformity. Then came the 1960s, and the world changed once more. The youth of a new generation began to question everything: war, authority, tradition. They wanted peace, love, and something real. Cannabis, once demonized, became their silent symbol. It wasn't just a drug, it was a statement. Smoking it said, "I refuse your fear." College campuses, music festivals, protests, clouds of sweet smoke floated through them all. The Beatles, Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, they sang about expanding minds and breaking walls. Cannabis was the common thread in a generation's rebellion, its calm heart in a chaotic time. Governments doubled down, creating harsher laws, but every crackdown only made the plant more powerful in the public imagination. Meanwhile, science began quietly circling back. In labs and universities, researchers started to rediscover what ancient healers had known for millennia: that cannabis had remarkable effects on the body and brain. It eased pain, reduced anxiety, helped people sleep. Even as politicians called it evil, doctors began to whisper again about its benefits. The old plant was telling its story all over again. To those willing to listen, the 1970s saw a strange contradiction: cultural acceptance on one side, criminal punishment on the other. People were arrested in one city for what was celebrated in another. Entire lives were ruined over a few grams, while songs about weed topped the charts. Governments couldn't decide if they were fighting a plant or an idea. By the 1980s, cannabis was part of the global language of counterculture. From reggae's sacred ganja to rock's lazy haze, from the hippies' peace signs to the activists' protests, it became a symbol of freedom from the machinery of control. But behind the haze, the war on drugs raged brutally. Communities were torn apart, especially in poorer and marginalized neighborhoods. The fear campaign had changed its mask, but not its heart. It was no longer about morals, it was about power. And yet, through every raid, every prison sentence, every headline, the plant kept growing quietly, persistently, like it always had. In bedrooms, basements, and gardens, it grew in the cracks of injustice. It grew in songs, art, laughter, and hope. It grew because people needed it, for pain, for peace, for a small reminder that the world could still be gentle. By the time the 1990s arrived, a shift began. California, always a place for dreamers and rebels, passed the first law allowing medical cannabis. Others followed. Patients with cancer, epilepsy, and chronic pain began to speak openly, telling stories of how the forbidden weed gave them their lives back. The same plant once called the devil's lettuce was now saving lives. Science caught up again, discovering cannabinoids and the endocannabinoid system, proof that humans were in some strange way built to connect with this plant. The story had come full circle. Thousands of years after the first spark of cannabis smoke rose in a prehistoric fire, humanity was once again learning to see it, not as a threat, but as an ally. Now, in the 21st century, the world stands divided but awakening. Some countries have legalized it completely. Others still cling to the fear born in the 1930s. But the truth doesn't vanish, it only waits. And cannabis has always been patient, because it's not just a drug. It's a story, a plant that has traveled with us through every age, every empire, every revolution. From ancient shamans to modern scientists, from sacred rituals to chill nights with friends, it has always been there, whispering the same quiet message: slow down, breathe, remember you are alive. And maybe that's what it was always about. Not escape, not rebellion, just peace, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to be real. In the quiet dawn of the 21st century, when the digital age began to hum and glow, the plant once hunted began to rise again, not in rebellion this time, but in recognition. The same smoke that ancient shamans offered to their gods now curled around LED screens and glass pipes, shared by people whose ancestors had been punished for even touching it. The world was changing fast, maybe too fast, and cannabis slipped back into the cracks of that chaos like it always did. Patient, familiar, ancient. In California, the Green Revolution started as a whisper, patients telling stories in waiting rooms, doctors willing to risk their licenses to help. There were no big corporations then, no dispensaries on every corner, just small growers, hidden in the hills, tending their plants like family. Each leaf was rebellion, each seed a prayer that someday the world would stop pretending to be afraid of something so human. The stories spread. Veterans who couldn't sleep without nightmares found peace again. Children with epilepsy stopped seizing. Cancer patients smiled for the first time in weeks. Families started to speak out. And slowly, politicians had to listen. The truth had outlasted the lies. By the 2010s, the movement had become unstoppable. States began to legalize cannabis, not out of kindness, but out of logic. Tax it, regulate it, profit from it. What had once been contraband was now commerce. The world that had burned fields now built glass storefronts and designer strains. Cannabis was no longer hiding in shadows. It stood proudly under neon lights. But even in this new light, the story wasn't simple. Legalization was not freedom for everyone. The same communities that had been destroyed by the war on drugs often weren't the ones profiting from the new industry. Men who had spent decades in prison for a few joints watched others build empires on the same plant. Justice, as always, was selective. Still, something beautiful was happening beneath the noise. Artists began to paint again, musicians to sing, people to gather without fear. The plant brought people together in the same way it always had, around campfires, couches, and quiet corners where conversation flowed slower and laughter came easier. It was no longer about escaping the world, but understanding it, a shared rhythm of thought and calm. The same rhythm our ancestors knew by heart. Science, too, began to listen seriously this time. Researchers discovered over 100 cannabinoids, molecules dancing with the human brain in intricate harmony. They found receptors in our bodies that seemed made for the plant, small locks waiting for a familiar key. It wasn't witchcraft or rebellion anymore. It was biology. Nature and humanity were not enemies, just old friends trying to remember each other's language. The world's perception shifted in waves. Canada legalized it, then Uruguay. Then entire US states followed one after another until the map began to turn green. The stigma faded, replaced by curiosity. Suddenly, the plant had become both medicine and market, symbol and commodity. It was in perfumes, chocolates, skincare, and stock portfolios. Cannabis wasn't just a plant anymore. It was a culture, an industry, a way of thinking. But deep down, under all the branding and marketing, it still whispered the same ancient truth. The same one that echoed in temples, in fields, in forgotten rituals, that the simplest things, a breath, a leaf, a moment of stillness can connect us to something larger than ourselves. And even now, in this age of hyperconnection and screens, people light up for the same reasons they always did. To feel, to remember, to soften the edges of a world that's too sharp. Cannabis became a mirror, showing us what kind of world we've built, what kind we've lost, and maybe what kind we still hope to create. In a way, it's funny. For centuries, humanity has fought over this plant, punished it, worshipped it, outlawed it, studied it, taxed it. But the plant never fought back. It just grew. It didn't care about politics or laws. It only cared about sunlight, water, and time. And time, as it turns out, has always been on its side. Because long before empires and science, before fear and propaganda, before even language, there was a person sitting by a fire, watching the smoke rise into the night. They didn't know the word cannabis. They just knew how it made them feel. Somewhere, in that same gentle silence, we're still doing the same thing. A spark, a breath, a moment. Maybe that's why this story never ends. Because it isn't just about a plant. It's about us. Our need to slow down. Our need to heal. Our need to remember that peace doesn't come from progress, it comes from presence. And if you sit long enough, in the quiet after the smoke fades, you might just feel it too, that ancient, patient calm that has followed us since the dawn of fire. The one that whispers, softly as the wind through leaves, "You've been here before."